All right, welcome to the next presentation for game design. We're going to be running right along as we would be as if this were the classroom, and this is another topic that I want to follow through on. We've talked a little bit about this earlier in the semester, but specifically today we're going to expand on the idea of how we play is who we are, and specifically personal and psychological archetypes. Again, these archetypes, there's this classical definition brought forth by psychiatrist Carl Jung that talks about potentials actualized when they enter the consciousness. And there are a lot of formalized definitions for it when we're talking about psychology and psychiatry. But for our terms, when we're talking about it regarding game design, again, I want to define what we're talking about specifically within this classroom frame, but also within game design. And here what we're talking about is statements, patterns of behaviors, and models which other statements, patterns of behaviors, and models tend to copy or merge or emulate. And so really what we're talking about in even simpler terms is this umbrella concept or idea about preferences, biases, and tendencies. And these are by default stereotypes. Now there are good stereotypes and bad stereotypes, but at their root, most stereotypes have some kernel of truth that's built around them. Otherwise, they would not have endured for as long as they have. So there are a lot of different formats, a lot of different guidelines and ways to be able to create archetypes and subdivide people into groups and things like that. But the thing is, not everybody neatly fits into any one of these categories simply because there are so many different types of archetypes and there are so many different types of people. So the accuracy and the goals can vary based on the group, based on the testing, and also the sort of archetype that you are trying to apply to a particular population. But one particular archetype tester is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's a very, very common one. Many of you may have already taken this test at one time before, but it's extremely popular because this framework is consistent and it's been done often enough that it's been evaluated and looked at and credited by tens of thousands, if not hundreds or millions of people by this point. So the Myers-Briggs type indicator looks at 4 dichotomy pairs or 4 sets of extreme characteristics or traits. And you evaluate these by answering a series of questions. They go through this algorithm then and results in one of 16 possible personality stereotypes or archetypes. So the different traits that this looks at are extrovert versus introvert, represented by an E or an I in its type indicator, then sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. And you'll notice at the bottom of this I've got a link that goes to the humanmetrics.com version of this particular testing and what these characteristics and traits are. So what's important about these opposing traits is that the Myers-Briggs type indicator purports or proposes that these sets of extremes are two ends of the opposite ends of a scale, like a seesaw or something like that. What it doesn't really take into account, though, is how extrovert or how introvert. While individual testing results might indicate that somebody is extremely extrovert, by the time you're done taking this test, you're either in one camp or the other, regardless of how strongly or how slightly you may have represented that particular characteristic. So when we take a look at these 8 pairs, since there are 8 versions with 2 answers, we end up with a total of 16 personality types. So the 4 criteria pairs result in one of these. So if you're an ISTJ, it means that you're introverted, sensing, thinking, and judging, where ENFP would be for extroverted, intuitive, feeling, and perceiving. And again, these are broad categories. Now, over the course of my life, I've actually taken this a number of times, at least 20 times, and almost every single time I've tested as an ENFJ, extroverted, intuitive, feeling, and judging. Now what's interesting is a lot of the different places where you'll take this test, it will return to you a particular set of results and a short little biography or outline, if you will, about what that particular combination or that particular archetype indicator tends to represent. So mine is quite long. You can read it if you want, but in general, idealist organizers striving to complete their visions, driven by what is best for humanity. Now, what's interesting about this is you can read into this, and in a way, it's almost like a horoscope. A lot of times people can read into these results what they want to. Obviously, I want to associate the positive characteristics and traits, the traits that I either do identify in myself or that I would like to identify in myself, and I look at those and go, yes, that is a lot like me. But just like a horoscope or just like anything else that is broadly applied to a large population or group of people, there are going to be some inconsistency or some things that just don't seem to fit right. Again, we're taking the whole of humanity, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, and saying that if they take this test, all of these people are going to fall into just one of 16 different categories. So no matter how well tested, how many times this has been taken, how well it is vetted, there are always flaws. So what is important to note is that this is not right or wrong. This is not an accurate measure of somebody's personality. This is not trying to put you into a box. It is merely a tool, a way to reflect, or from afar, if I were to learn somebody else's characteristic set, I might have a little better insight into them as a person. So let's take a look at that statement again about how it summarized an ENFJ. And this time what I've done is I've color-coded it based on the different characteristics and traits and my particular responses or reactions to them. The ones listed in red, such as idealist organizer or driven by what is best for humanity, are the parts of this analysis that I don't particularly agree with. I don't really see myself embracing or embodying that particular aspect of its definition of an ENFJ. On the contrary, those marked in green, like seeing potential in other people, acutely aware of human suffering, those are things that I do associate with. Those are things that I either do positively and actually see in myself, or again, subconsciously, I would like to think that I have these traits and characteristics. And then the one in blue, typically energetic and driven, I think is a fantastic example of, again, how no matter how well devised or tested something is, at the end of the day, a lot of this just depends. A lot of it can depend on environmental bias, on how and where you're taking a test. So typically energetic and driven, well, I don't know. That's really different if I take that test on a day where I've got 8, 9 hours of sleep versus a day where I've only had 3 hours of sleep and I don't have any caffeine and I'm really, really jittery and things like that. Or maybe I had a really bad day in an argument with my wife or something else went wrong. So again, just like our biases can affect how we act at the gaming table, the biases can also affect how we might answer the questions related to this test and slightly shape or manipulate the results that we get. So the Myers-Briggs type indicator is just one of dozens and dozens of tools like this. So let's take a look at a tool that is very much related to gaming. And I think one of the best type indicator tests or systems with gaming has got to be the Dungeons and Dragons alignment system. Now, whether or not you've played Dungeons and Dragons, you may be familiar with a number of these characteristics and traits. And in general, what the alignment system does is it takes a player character, such as the paladin that you're playing or the rogue that you're playing, and based on their behaviors or worldview, it looks at 2 sets of contrasting characteristics. And it breaks down behaviors by comparing your role and outlook of law versus chaos, meaning your ability to work with and live within laws, standards, and guidelines by society, versus chaos, which would be your aversion to those particular guidelines. And then the other measure is this extreme example of good versus evil. Do you tend to follow positive, well-intentioned, and good behaviors, or are you really in it for yourself? Are you truly an evil person? What sort of character are you? What sort of behaviors do you tend to display? And how would others in this setting perceive or judge you? So since we've got these different characteristics, what you end up with is a number, because there's also a balance point between these. So law versus chaos is a continuum, but there is a center point in that continuum, and that is represented by neutral. So in looking at law versus chaos, what we're actually looking at are 3 different ways that might be interpreted. Lawful good, lawful neutral, or lawful evil. Now, each of these follows the law. They follow guidelines. They follow societal norms. But a lawful good person, like a paladin, goody two-shoes. They're the ideal police officer or cop. They're the people who follow the rules, who won't bend them even if it's a minor thing. They wouldn't be telling the white lies that some people might. Lawful neutral would be concerned about following and upholding laws, but instead of being good, they're a little bit more aware of the need for balance between good and evil, that sometimes there are necessary evils and sometimes there are unavoidable goods, but still following structure is important. Whereas lawful evil might be the sort of person where the Hitler, where there are very well established rules and guidelines and conducts for behavior that are expected by him and his followers, but it's kind of hard to argue against the evil nature of Nazism in this particular case. So then if neutral is this mid-ground, that also means that neutral is one of these precursor adjectives, so that we've got neutral good, they're ambivalent toward guidelines, and they're ambivalent toward maybe societal norms, but they're still good-hearted in general, and they still would prefer to do good than otherwise. Then the alignment known as true neutral, where they're either ambivalent or they're freewheeling, they follow wanderlust or their own internal motivations and direction, and they're not bound one way or the other by what society's expectations are. And then neutral evil, where again they might not follow nor necessarily break out of routine guidelines and expectations, but again they have more of a penchant for either selfish motivations or screwing other people over. So that leaves us then with chaos, the extreme opposite end of law. So even though things can be chaotic, and even though people can break against guidelines, rules, and all of these other concepts, you still can do that and be good. You still can do that and still follow a roughly neutral guideline or style, but then what we would consider probably most really banal or plain, regular bad guys and villains from a lot of movies and literature would probably be that chaotic evil. They don't necessarily have a plan, they don't necessarily follow order, structure, or guidelines, but they are truly inherently bad. They're the ones with the whole goal of being to ruin things or to kill people, right? So if you take a look at this and try to apply it to different people, you might argue that Thanos in the Marvel cinematic universe might actually be lawful neutral. He's dispassionate about things, but he has rules, he has guidelines, he has certain things that he's trying to follow, at least during Infinity War. But then during Endgame, you might see him shift from lawful neutral to lawful evil, where toward the end of that, he does still have guidelines that he is following, but you know what? He's done with these pesky heroes and he wants to get rid of them, so he's going to just bring thunder and hellfire down on them and try to ruin them. And it's interesting to take a look at these and see kind of where might you fall. Well, I like to think that I follow guidelines. I know that I'm not very good at it, but in my heart of hearts, I do like to think that I do more good than evil. But I tend to be a little, loosey-goosey and fly from the hip and kind of shoot my mouth off, and so don't always follow orders or instructions well. So does that make me chaotic good? Does that make me neutral good? Take a look at this, and there are a list of lots of these different tests and things like that. I've got a link at the bottom of this one to the Wizards of the Coast definition of these characteristics and what these different alignments are. But you can find a lot of different alignment tests. What D&D character are you? And those are kind of fun to take. Well, let's look at another game-specific example here, specifically Magic the Gathering. Now, what's really interesting is this was originally proposed by Mark Rosewater back in 2002. He was one of the designers of Magic the Gathering, and it really looks at and analyzes those early Magic the Gathering metas, or that means the different play styles that had started to emerge around the game, especially once they started to see more and more tournament play and high-level play. And what amazes me is Magic came out in the mid-1990s, and even at that point, after less than 10 years on the market, they had seen hundreds of thousands of examples, such a huge sample base, and they were able to boil all of the hundreds of thousands of Magic the Gathering players down into just 3 basic types. And the fancy term for those is a psychographic profile. Now, if this concept or idea interests you, again, there's a link at the bottom of this where you can read more about Mark Rosewater's idea in his original post on his blog. But this idea of the psychographic profile, it's a fancy term, but basically what it means is that it's just a way to break players into different categories based on the psychological motivations, what makes up their desire, need, or urge to play. And this feeds into the types of cards and the types of gameplay that they enjoy. But the other part, and what's interesting from a business and a design standpoint, is when you understand the psychographic profile and you understand what motivates a player, then you also understand the sorts of things like what kind of cards, what kind of abilities encourage that player to keep playing. You want them to continue playing Magic the Gathering, because the more they play your game, hopefully the more they are going to invest and buy into your game. Now, parallel to these psychographic profiles is something called an aesthetic profile. So while the psychographic profile is from the mental side and looks at different behaviors on why they play, aesthetic is a little bit more about how different people find beauty in the game. So some labels mean that you're high enough on the scale that your identity within this Magic the Gathering spectrum shows where you find beauty. And there is no necessary link between aesthetic and psychographic profiles, because you can enjoy playing Magic for one reason, but you can find it beautiful for another. And aesthetic might be the actual artistic aesthetic, like you love the layout and the design, and you love the mythos and the legend and the story behind it, or you love the evocative pictures of white and the very good-natured part of it and how the angels and seraphs are represented in there. Or you may just enjoy the dichotomy of all of the different colors and how they oppose each other and the story behind the planeswalkers there. Lots of different ways that can be represented. But again, going back to these psychographic profiles, Rosewater had broken them down into 3 specific goals, or 3 different types. And these are the types. The first psychographic profile is Timmy, or Tammy. The profile is characterized by big creatures, big spells. Timmy plays for fun and all kinds of huge, over-the-top things. Spells, creatures, enchantments. And Timmy tends to be the most social archetype. They get their fun in the game by interacting with all the different systems and combinations that Magic provides. Timmy tends to be a younger player who builds decks for fun. So Timmy doesn't care whether they win or lose, but they want to have fun playing really big effects. So some good examples here are this Impervious Great Worm is a hugely expensive spell. 3 green and 7 colorless is an enormously high cost for somebody who would otherwise be playing in a really, really competitive environment. But when this splashes the table, when somebody plays this, it has a huge, oh my goodness, that's so amazing moment there. It's a 16/16 creature. Wow, like Timmy being able to get the Impervious Great Worm to the table would be a win for them. Or something like a Fireball, which can be a really aggressive spell and a really cool way to play. But a Timmy might hold back on casting Fireball till they've got a ton of mana and they're able to make a huge splash and hit a whole bunch of creatures at once, right? So they want to enjoy the game by playing huge, big effects. So the second archetype is Johnny or Jenny. And Johnny loves the mental exercise. Johnny really enjoys the challenge of creating the decks. They love the deck building, sometimes even more than the deck playing. And so Johnny builds complex and creative decks. Johnny loves looking for combos. They love looking at ways of creating the sort of deck that somebody else might not. Interesting ways to combine cards and then either break or incorporate niche or bad cards. Johnny likes to exploit things, and Johnny likes to win on their own terms. So you could also take a look at this and say Johnny is happiest when their special deck works, and they win that way. Good example of this is every once in a while Magic the Gathering will introduce these series of cards in different sets that individually look really, really weak and pathetic. And most people wouldn't even consider putting them into a deck. But Johnny takes a look at those as a creative challenge and wants to find a way to bring those out. So for a long time, there were these squirrels. Squirrels were introduced many, many years ago, and there were a lot of different squirrel tokens, and squirrels were 1 green spell creatures that were 1/1s, and squirrels were basically useless fodder on their own. But if we look here, the Earl of Squirrel has a special ability that's not on any other character called Squirrel Link. Damage dealt by this creature also causes you to create a whole bunch of 1/1 green squirrel tokens. Oh my goodness, you can just splatter more squirrels out on the field. Plus, all other squirrels that you control get +1/+1. That's amazing. Any other tokens that you control are also considered squirrels, which mean they get +1/+1. So combined with Squirrel Mob, where the mob gets +1/+1 for each other squirrel on the battlefield, well, it's already going to be a 2/2 creature, then a 3/3 if the Earl of Squirrel is out there. But then if the Earl of Squirrel just does 4 points of damage and creates 4 more tokens, then all of a sudden that Squirrel Mob is now a 7/7 creature, and, it can just go nuts and crazy from there. And Johnny is most excited when he's able to pull off those sorts of things, when he can get away with something, create a combo, or maybe put together a deck that's a lot more effective than other people might think. Then finally, the third different archetype is Spike. Spike is an alpha player. Spike is ultra competitive. Spike finds the best deck or the best build in the meta, even if that means coming up with somebody else's work. Spikes can be found in a lot of fields, like Overwatch, for example. With the current 2/2/2 build of 2 tanks, 2 damage dealers, and 2 support, the highest level, most competitive teams, there tend to be certain builds that are just clearly better than others, especially when you have people with the skill to be able to work with those different moving parts. Spike is that sort of player. Super competitive. Spike's cards are effective and designed to secure a fast, effective victory. So Spike can also sometimes be a little of a malcontent. They can be alpha players. Sometimes they can be grumbly. But when you're looking at Spike purely on their own, one of the best ways to summarize Spike wants to win. They want to punch you in the mouth. They want to crush your spirit doing it. Spike is in it to win it, right? And so Spike will just overwhelm you and try to do what they can to just dominate the playfield and either bum rush and try to get a real quick win, or they find a way to just grind you under their heel. Sometimes it can be really exciting and fun to play against a Spike because of the challenge, and other times it's just frustrating as heck because they want to win at all costs where you might be there to have fun and have a different goal. So, all right, why do we care about these? And as game designers, how can we benefit from understanding personality or psychic profiles? Well, there are a number of ways that this proves useful and helpful to us. Most importantly, understanding who plays your game informs what decisions they find meaningful or interesting. That is hugely important. If you don't know who plays your games, if you don't know what they enjoy doing, then as a designer or as a publisher, you can't design to fit. You can't give them more of what they want. And if you can't provide more of what they want, they're going to find an alternative. They're going to find something else to do with all of that money. So this allows you to design toward a specific player type. So back to those different magic archetypes, when a new block of cards comes out, designers can get together and make sure that they have a few cards in there that are going to satisfy the way Timmy plays, the way Johnny plays, and the way Spike plays. And that way they come up with a well-rounded set. But it's not just people and players that fall under these different profiles and archetypes. Designers do as well. So designer Seppi Yoon is a friend of mine and he founded Fight in Box Games, and he came up with a really interesting series of designer archetypes that he presented at an IGDA meeting last year. He's located in Minneapolis, and he's designed a couple games like Squirrel or Die and Serving Humanity, and he's a frequent contributor to Dice Tower and podcast and vidcasts. He's also just a really, really super nice guy, but he proposed that there are 4 types of people who make games, and he generally created them and boiled them down to one of 4 archetypes. All right, so you've got Edison and Albert Einstein and some crazy sports ball fan there, right? And so you can just kind of see and imagine right there that these archetypes, again, broad categories, not everybody always falls neatly into them, but these stereotypes help us associate certain traits. And the first archetype that Seppi proposes is the genius, whose main goal is innovation. And he uses as his example Richard Garfield, designer of Magic the Gathering, Robo Rally, and King of Tokyo. And the characteristics of a genius, their strengths are that they tend to be prolific developers. They can create a lot of content. And for them, gamifying things, which means taking game design principles and applying them to non-game situations. Like, how could you apply game design principles in the understanding of the design process, of the decision-making process, to building a better gas station, or to creating better curriculum for a fifth grade classroom, right? They can apply game concepts to every world things. They also seem to be visionaries and have this ability to just look ahead or look inside the industry or mechanics and see things that other people don't. The flip side, though, is sometimes they can lose focus, and sometimes they are victims of their own recognition. They're so well known for some games, like Richard Garfield is so well known for Magic the Gathering, Robo Rally, and King of Tokyo now, that sometimes he'll put out something else that just doesn't seem to have the same sort of impact, and people are kind of like, ho-hum, it's okay, but it's not a Magic the Gathering. Well, nothing else is going to be. And this genius archetype is happiest when they are writing and designing their games. The next archetype is the promoter. They're the people who love to just celebrate the idea of games and get games out there and get them into people's hands. And this is probably best exemplified by the idea of games like Exploding Kittens and Cards Against Humanity, where they are shameless self-promoters of their own games. So the great thing about these people are promoters. Their enthusiasm and love and passion for gaming is infectious. These games kind of set wildfire and they catch people's imaginations. These people tend to be very, very approachable because they're laid back, they're funny, they're humorous, and they're kind of easy peasy, kind of like their games are as well. They also tend to be very community-minded, so when they're designing, they're thinking about the people they are designing for, not necessarily the mechanics. They're designing for a certain effect. Now, the downside to this sort of archetype is sometimes these games lack a certain depth of play, or because of the simplicity of their games, they don't have the same credibility that a serious designer might. Right? So as successful as Cards Against Humanity is as a game, it's an evergreen game that sold millions of copies. People don't look at the designers of Cards Against Humanity the same way that they look with reverence at a Richard Garfield, right? Because at the end of the day, Cards Against Humanity is just a reskin of Apples to Apples. Regardless, though, the promoter is happiest when they are selling their games, when they're making that direct connection and interaction with the public. They also love to promote the heck out of their games. So here's an example of Exploding Kittens at a convention. I think this was at PAX East. Oh no, this was at Gen Con, where they had, while people were waiting in line, they had this really, really weird booth that was almost like an arcade vending booth area with this fuzzy exterior and all of these buttons. I think it was to figure out what type of exploding kitten you were. It was just this weird, wacky way of promoting their game. It certainly wasn't necessary, but it interacted with fans in an interesting way and gave them something to do while they were sitting around either waiting in line or waiting to play the game. So the next type of character is the fanatic, the person who's got this sole laser-like focus. And these are exemplified by a lot of these games that are designed through by a single person or a small entity. So for video games, it might be your Undertale, or for board games, Monster Kingdom Death, or something else, a big shop game done by just one person like Gloomhaven or something like that. So the fanatic tends to be singularly focused. They've got this idea, and because it's either an individual or a very small group of people, they can follow through because they are the direction maker. They're the one in charge of all the decisions and can steer this in the direction specifically the way they want. The fanatic is also willing to make a lot of sacrifices other people might not be, whether that's a sacrifice of money, a sacrifice of social opportunities, or even a sacrifice to their own health. I know a lot of people in this industry who are bipolar, and a number of fanatics tend to fall into this category as well. They tend to be hyper productive during these super high-end peaks of manic behavior, But the downside is sometimes they can be a little standoffish or difficult to approach. They might be socially awkward. And also, because there are so many things that it takes for a game to become successful, a Fanatic is good at a number of them, but their focus on mechanics, design, and their own personal vision for a game might end up with them being less aware of or proficient with the business side of it. So while designing Gloomhaven, for example, I would have to imagine that it's hard to take into account that the more content that you had, what appreciable impact it's going to have on the market value or the actual cost to produce this game, like $250 game, because of all the miniatures, all the content, all the materials. But when you want to design the game that you want, all of those things take a back seat. So the Fanatic is happiest when their games are done, when they are complete. I've talked about this, that you design a game but you end up with a product. They love design, but they are happiest when they can put their stamp of approval on it and say, I'm done and now I can rest. The final archetype that Seppiun talks about is the enhancer. They're somebody that is in it either for the recognition or they are recognized for the contributions that they have made either to their own games or their association with and attribution to other people's ideas, games, and ability. So the enhancer, they tend to be either a tastemaker or they tend to know a particular style very, very well, such as deck building, and they can go in and they can improve other people's deck building games or role-playing games. And so they might design great role-playing games, but when another company or publisher is also designing a game, they might reach out to an enhancer to help them provide some input since that's an area of their expertise. They tend to be really great around other people. They're team-oriented. They can tend to be both subjective and objective and look at things from different standpoints. So they can look at an idea because they might not always be emotionally vested in someone else's concept and say, you know what, taking a look at it from my position, I think that this might be a good approach to take. They're also fantastic at looking at other ideas and improving on them. And they're happiest during the journey, during the discovery process, when the light bulb moment goes off and they're able to see how something might work or interact. The downside is they can be really, really difficult when it comes to working on their own. Right? They're great when they're surrounded by people and they can riff off of other ideas, when they can have a jam session about game design, but sometimes they find themselves when they're working in a vacuum to run into analysis paralysis and writer's block and simply run out of steam. They don't know what to do when there's not somebody else there who has their back. So Seppi goes on to basically break down a couple steps that you can take to manage yourself and become better as a designer, taking these things into account. And the first thing to know is to understand your happiness. Where does your happiness come from as a game designer? And this applies to students, it applies to established designers, it applies to people who are just interested in learning more about this. But know where your happiness is and lean into it. Are you happiest when you are creating a game? Are you happiest when you're working with others? What makes you the happiest about game design? Take advantage of that and make sure that you are working on that. The second thing that you can do is to then, on the flip side, know your weaknesses, right? Not just understanding that I am no good at working on my own or I'm really poor at business management, but have a better appreciation for how they get in the way. How are they stopping you from being successful? Or are there things that you can do to help offset your weaknesses so that they do not hinder progress? Third, everybody needs to have someone in their corner. Everybody needs a battle buddy, somebody that you can rely on, whether it's a social network, whether it's a forum, whether it's friends and family, whether it's somebody to bounce ideas off of your playtest group, your Dungeons and Dragons group, classmates, an instructor, a mentor, whoever it might be. You don't have to go into battle alone. Right? Very little in game design truly happens with one person going from an initial idea all the way to production, distribution, and sales. So it's great to have these other people that you can rely on, talk to, and enjoy this process with along the way. And then finally, understanding scheduling and accepting that you are going to have to set milestones, there are going to need to be deadlines, and embracing your calendar. And in the day of digital calendars, There's no excuse to not be able to set up reminders on a calendar, to set up an email or an alert that goes off to tell you that you've got until Wednesday to deliver this, or that your next prototype needs to be done by the end of the week. So take some time at the beginning of that project, at the beginning of this entire process of the design and development part, and you know what? Set yourself some deadlines. Here are the things that I'm going to need to achieve along the way. Here's the order in which they need to be achieved. And then finally, here are some dates that I'm going to set myself, that I'm going to make sure that I nail these things in order so that I can get finished on time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a follow-up to How We Play is Who We Are, and a look at the personal and psychological archetypes that make up individuals, whether or not they're gamers, the different types of gamers that we have. We looked at the alignment system in Dungeons & Dragons. We looked at the Timmy, Johnny, and Spike archetypes from Magic the Gathering, but then also the game design archetypes as well, and how they help us look at the different roles and responsibilities that different game designers have. And again, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this whole idea of archetypes is they are general, broad categories. Not one archetype applies to every person, and not every person is going to fit snugly and neatly into a single archetype. You might see and appreciate different aspects from a number of archetypes, and that's fine. But at the bottom line, end of the day, what we're looking at is a better understanding of these archetypes, the better understanding of how people play, what motivates them, and the sort of characteristics that make up their personality. The better we can interact with those people, the better we can understand their needs, and the better we can design games to satisfy their interests. And that is it for this presentation on How We Play is Who We Are.